everyone. My name is Ashley Brown. I am a pediatrician and a transgender woman, and I've been looking forward to this podcast for a long time. I enjoy talking about how I identify. I do this with families every day, talk with them about their kids and just how to communicate effectively, right? That's a big part of my job. And so, this podcast is really just going to be about, those things. I want to help find ways for others in the trans community, the larger queer community, allies, and people that do not support us to be able to talk, communicate, and find ways to work together on a way forward, because being trans in our world is very difficult right now in a lot of ways. And, I'll talk about that more in some future podcasts, why it's so hard, but it's become very political. And there's a lot of things that surround being trans that, are difficult. And my perspective has changed over the years. I am now 47 years old. When I was younger, I had no idea I was trans. I led a life as, really a life of privilege. That's what I led. And in the last 4 years, I have found myself, my true self. And since that time, my life has not only changed, but it's been interesting to see how I view the world and how being as part of a minority is so much different. And I think that's been a big deal for a lot of us in the trans community as well. So the topic for today I'd like to discuss in more depth has to do with gender identity, as well as the idea of choice, right? Do members of the trans community, including myself, do we have a choice in who we are on the inside? And so I'll start with a couple definitions, particularly for those that are new to words and terminology we use in the community, right? But, just to make sure we're all on the same page, I think it's important. So gender identity has to do with the person you are on the inside, different than gender expression, which is what you look like or choose to look like on the outside, right? Notice I use the word choice associated with expression. And what I'm going to focus on today is that inner part of yourself, your gender identity. Being trans, as most of you probably know what that is, but if you have heard the word, you think you know, but you're not 100% sure, generally how it's defined, and again, there's not one definition, but I will tell you one way it's common, is if you are assigned one sex at birth. So for me, I was assigned male at birth, and I identify differently than that. Therefore I am trans, right? I identify as trans based on that. If you are born assigned a certain sex, that's how you identify when you get older. Most people I would refer to as cisgender, right? As opposed to me, right, who is transgender. The reason I want to talk about choice today in reference to my gender identity is it's a common question I've had from friends and family. And I know others in the trans community have had those questions too. And it goes something like this. When did you decide or choose to live as a woman? And there's variations of that question, I've heard or been asked to as well. But it brings up a really good point about being trans and what it's all about. And also, what's kind of appropriate, what's not, as far as, how to talk to trans people. I think it can be difficult to talk to others that identify differently than you do. And there's a lot of reasons for that I'll get into in future podcasts. But I think it's just one more step on the way of communicating more effectively between folks that identify in different ways. So to help answer this question of choice and gender identity, I'm going to take you back in my life to 4.5 years ago. This was in April of 2020, right around the time that COVID started. I was working in clinic at the time at the University of Iowa, seeing patients there. I had a wonderful staff that I worked with, was working in the best job that I had ever had at the time. I was married to a wonderful person, had two amazing kids then. I had a supportive family, supportive friends. You might think I had it all at that time, but on the inside, I really struggled for a long time, and I had struggled with depression and anxiety, a lot of the things that folks in the trans community deal with every day. And I didn't understand at the time why I struggled so much. And I had more time on my hands in clinic when COVID started. I didn't have very many patients I was seeing then. I had more time to kind of think through things in my life. And I don't know if that's the reason why I kind of had an epiphany, I guess is the best way to put it, but I think it had something to do with it. But at that time, I realized, wow, there's something different about me. Something's different about my gender identity. There was some things that led up to that, of course, that maybe clued me in, hindsight being 2020, but that was the beginning of my journey. That's the time when I really embarked on this phase in my life of figuring out who I really am on the inside. Now, at that time, when I thought, wow, my gender identity is different than I thought. And at that time, I was thinking I was trans, but I didn't know for sure. And so, I thought a lot about it, right? That over those next several months. And I thought, wow, who can I talk to? What can I do during this time? I've got supportive people that surround me, but none of them were trans. And I found it extremely difficult during that time to find a way to tell others about it. And so I didn't, right? And it was about a year later after that time that I finally had discussions with a couple of different people. That would include my wife, my first therapist at the time. And that's kind of how it started. That's how my journey kind of took another step forward, at that time to figuring out the real me on the inside. And then over the course of the next 2 years, working hard in therapy, and talking through those parts of myself on the inside that were there, but maybe I didn't understand were there, I finally came to the conclusion and understood, listened to that part of myself that I was indeed trans, right? That I was assigned male at birth, a boy, but I was indeed a woman. And what did I do? What was the first thing I do after figuring these things out? I rejected it. I said to my therapist that no, this is great. I'm a woman, but guess what? I can't move forward in my life, right? As a woman, with the barriers in society, with the concerns of my marriage, with the concerns of how my family and friends would take it, my coworkers, all of these things were things that I struggle with a lot at that time. And I thought there is no way I could ever get through those things and find a way to express this to others other than just keeping this in private where only a couple of people, maybe a handful, really truly knew. I remember saying, I do have a choice, right? I'm Adam. That's who I have learned to be. That was my birth name, is Adam, right? That's who I grew up being, Adam Brown. And I said, that's who I'd live to be. This is my person. This is me. I may be a woman, but I'm also Adam, right? I'm also that person that I was assigned at birth, right? I'm also that person. So at that time, I thought, yes, I am. I'm a woman, but I'm also Adam, right? I'm also that person. And, over time, thinking about my gender identity kind of is this in two ways, right? As a woman and then as a man too as well. It wasn't helpful, right? I was really rejecting a part of myself and saying that, I still am a man. There's a part of me that's a man, and that just wasn't true. And I noticed that my anxiety, my depression, those things did not improve. In fact, they really got worse during that time. Despite the therapy, despite the discussions, despite all the hard work I'd done, despite the hours of time I'd spent outside of therapy, sitting with my feelings, thinking about these things, right? Despite all that time I put into it, I was still very depressed. I had thoughts of hurting myself, right, during that time. In fact, those thoughts got worse. And I know for others in the trans community, this is a common scenario when it comes to depression, is to have thoughts of hurting yourself as well. So during these 2 years I mentioned, after I first talked with my wife and my first therapist, I met with another therapist and started seeing her. And that was around the time where I finally realized who I truly was and that I was Ashley. I was, am, and will always be a woman. And of course, did I know I would always be a woman at that time? No, but the point being that that's simply who I was, right? And that Adam, the man I had been my whole life, who I thought I was still a part of me, was still a big part of my life, right? Was more of a construct, more somebody I had learned to be in my life. And as I kind of figured out in therapy, kind of a shield, a way to kind of protect myself in a way and kind of conform to those social norms of what we often expect of men. And this brings us back to what I talked about in the beginning, that question of gender identity and choice. And I would tell you, this is around the time, and this is about 2 years ago, looking back today, when I thought, you know what? No, I am a woman. I'm not a man. And I don't have a choice. This is simply who I was. And that was what I needed to focus on and find a way forward based on that. So when other people ask me a question about, when did I decide or choose to live as a woman, I'll often react or, say, things in reference to what I just explained, that, gender identity really isn't a choice and that, really it's just who we are on the inside. And sometimes the most important part of that process isn't so much about a change or a choice. It's digging into that deeper part of yourself and finding that person you truly are. And, I think everybody's had moments in their life where they realize something about their person on the inside, not related to their gender identity, things that they didn't know about, didn't maybe suspected, but weren't sure. Maybe it was something that happened in childhood that has affected you throughout your life, and you didn't realize just to what extent it did. Those are the kinds of things that I'm getting at. My gender identity was there. It had been there for a long, long time, right? I knew. There was a part of me that knew for sure since I was 13 years old that, I was a woman, but I had learned to live my life one way, but that only took me so far, right? I needed to find a way forward, one with less depression, less anxiety, and where I didn't think about hurting myself. And as a pediatrician who's seen other kids take their lives, families I've known in my career that have been heartbreaking for me to see, it scared me. The idea that I could hurt myself, right, and take my own life, especially with a marriage and kids and all the other commitments around me, right? Those are such a big deal. I needed to find a way forward in my life, one where I could continue to progress in some way. I could find a way to be happy, right? That's the ultimate goal for a lot of us, the ultimate goal in therapy. And whether you feel that happiness is achieved personally, it's achieved through glorifying a higher entity or being, right? Happiness is important. It's important in life, right? To focus on that. It's important for us as human beings. And for me personally, just surviving, finding ways to just live wasn't enough. I wanted to live my life fully and be happy with it, not just plod one step in front of the other day to day. So that's when I made a choice. And this is where choice comes in, right? When it comes to gender, I didn't make a choice to be a woman. I chose to find a path forward with my kids, my family, to be a better father, and to be happy. And those series of choices were what I could influence, right? Were a part of my path forward in life. But as far as my gender identity is concerned and the person on the inside, I think what was most important is for me to let go of the idea that I could control these things, that I could decide my path forward in life, that I could be a man and be happy. Unfortunately for me, at the time, it's not unfortunate now, but at the time I thought, wow, unfortunately I can't do that, right? Well, since that time, I've embraced who I am. It's not unfortunate. It's a fortunate thing. It's a good thing, right? Who I am now. And it's unlocked things in my life I never knew could be or would be true. So when others ask me this question about choice and gender identity, these are the things I talk about, right? What I just discussed. I also talk about things I do have choices of, and it's more than just what I just mentioned. Sure, I had a choice to move forward as my true self, right? My authentic self. That's a common terms that are used in the trans community. I did. That was a choice. But what do I do with that, right? What does that mean? Well, for some in our community, that means that acknowledgement, maybe some choices or changes in private are all that is needed to be happy, right? That's true for many in the trans community. That doesn't require any other changes, that people can be happy with those things. But that wasn't enough for me. It really wasn't. So, kind of living my life as my true self, embracing that, living as a woman, that was a choice, right? Those are choices I made, right? To live my life as such. So, putting on clothes, wearing makeup, purchases I make, all those things are choices I make, right? But you're choosing to be a woman is not one of them. And I think when, there's some subtle differences, I think, between how that question is asked, which can be in a great way or a triggering way for folks in the trans community. But I think one thing to keep in mind when talking to folks that are trans, is that focusing on maybe less on the gender part of it when asking the question and more so on the other stuff, like, how are you doing? How have things been going? And asking more about those open-ended questions with less focus on discussing the term woman or man, right? Those types of things. I think that's a safer way and a better way for a lot of us in our community, to be addressed and to talk about it. So those are things to keep in mind, going forward. For those of you listening that have run into this, maybe are not trans yourself and don't always know how to talk to us. And keep in mind too that this is a two-way street, right? It's important for us in the trans community to be open to questions. I like to explain myself. I like to talk about, questions that may be triggering to me. I like to talk about it. I still like to bring them up and discuss as an opportunity to educate, someone. But that's not true for everyone in the trans community, right? Some people are going to be like, you know what? That's not okay. Get away from me, outside of my bubble. I don't want to talk to you. And that's okay too, right? That's perfectly legitimate. And there's reasons behind that, which, I'll get into that in future podcasts as well. But I think the big takeaway here, gender identity is not a choice, right? It really isn't. It's something that each of us has that's important to all of us. For folks that identify as, cisgender, right, and identify the same way they were assigned at birth, oftentimes this isn't something people think about at all, right? Your gender identity is a complex process, right? But as people get older, it's not something they think about, not something that they oftentimes need to consider. It is a part of them. And there's lots of other things in life to have to think about and worry about. So, but for people that are trans, it's often different, right? This is a big focus for us and something we have to spend a lot of time with. Our society often brings us up to think one thing, whereas in reality, we're something else. And that dissonance, that difference between the two, is what creates a lot of the symptoms that trans folks have and why we move forward in our life with things like transitioning. Suffice it to say for today, just keep that idea in mind about choice. Thank you for listening today. I appreciate it. If you felt this was helpful, that's great. If not, we'll cover something else next time. Until then, have a good day, and I'll talk with you guys again soon.